Hi everybody, Caleb Brundell here, and this is your video for the 21st day of the Acts Challenge, which means we are in Acts chapter 21. Here, Paul and his entourage, which now includes the author, leave Miletus, which is south of Ephesus, and head towards Jerusalem. Now, here is your map of the area because in the first verses here, there is a detailed description of the group's journey south. Lots of names, lots of places, and that's because this is all written in the first person. The author is with them, and so the author is recording these details of the journey. As they make their way south in verses 4 through 5, the disciples that they meet in Tyre, which is a very historic city and has quite the history if you want to read up on it on your own. But the disciples in Tyre say, Paul, the Spirit told us don't go to Jerusalem. And then they immediately go to Jerusalem. Now, that is different than what we've seen in other parts of Acts. If you recall from previous chapters, there were times where the author says, the Spirit of Jesus prevented us from going to Macedonia, or the Spirit, wouldn't let us go to this part of Asia. And so here's something different where the author says, the Spirit told the people of Tyre, tell Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. And they go anyway. And we don't get like an explanation of that. So it is the way it is. It is what it is. Paul's going to Jerusalem. In verse 8, you'll notice that they stay in the house of Philip, who was one of the 7 who was chosen to serve food distribution back in the early years in the church in Jerusalem. And you can read about Philip and the 7 that are chosen to serve in chapter 6, verses 1 through 6 here in Acts. So we meet Philip again. In verses 10 through 14, there is this prophecy that a fate awaits Paul in Jerusalem. And like in Tyre, Paul is determined to go to Jerusalem no matter what. And the only response that people have to this is the Lord's will be done. And sometimes that's the only response we can have in situations where it just seems like things are going to happen and there's not a whole lot we can do. We can just say the Lord's will be done. And that's how the disciples respond here to Paul's adamant set that he is going to Jerusalem. All right. In verses 17 through 22, the leaders in Jerusalem tell Paul that, hey, we're super cool with the message that you have proclaimed to the Gentiles. It's what we decided back in chapter 15, if you remember that, when they had the council in Jerusalem. But the leaders in Jerusalem tell Paul, the Jewish leadership is not going to be cool with you being here. And this follows the pattern that we've seen throughout the second half of the book of Acts, that wherever Paul goes, there is an uproar and things happen. So the church leaders in Jerusalem come up with this plan to have Paul join in this ritual with others, and there's some more haircuts and whatnot, that in this ritual takes place in the temple. And they concoct this scheme as a public demonstration that Paul is still very Jewish and Paul is very much keeping the law and the rituals and going to the temple and following all the rules like a good Pharisee would, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, all that stuff. In verse 25, the leaders of Jerusalem mention again that letter from chapter 15 that they sent with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch. So it's interesting that they say, hey, here's the rules we told the Gentiles in the letter. Like, Paul was there in chapter 15 when they decided it, and the letter was specifically sent with Paul and Barnabas. So it's interesting that the author repeats that again, but whatever. Nothing wrong with repeating the good stuff. All right. So they go to the temple. In verses 27 through 30, Paul is seized in the temple, and they have this false claim brought against Paul that he brought a Gentile, a Greek, into the temple. Now, the way the text is written, the author is saying that's not what happened. They were mistaken. They just thought, since, hey, we know Paul's in Jerusalem, we know he's going to the temple, we saw Paul with a Greek, a Gentile person somewhere else in Jerusalem, therefore, we are going to connect some dots that don't need connecting and say that Paul brought a Greek person to the temple, which is a huge no-no. We had just read about all the things that go into someone going to the temple sometimes. And here Paul is just accused falsely of bringing someone willy-nilly there. All right. So that causes a huge thing, huge uproar. When they seize Paul in the temple in verses 31 through 36, the Roman authority, the tribunal, has to intervene to stop this incipient riot or revolt that's taking place. And Paul is taken into what we could think of as protective custody. Not that the tribunal thinks he's broken rules, but he knows I have to remove this person from this place or things are going to get really nasty for the town and for this person. Okay. In verse 38, the tribunal makes reference that since Paul is speaking Greek with him, Paul cannot be this person who sparked a recent kind of rebellion or religious movement, a recent rebel rouser, if you will, which there were a lot of in that Roman province, as we see through history. Now, we don't get a lot of details in the text here in Acts, but there is mentioned by the historian Josephus in his works, The Jewish Wars. Josephus does mention that there was an Egyptian, doesn't name a name, but an Egyptian who led a group of followers out into the wilderness around Jerusalem, proclaiming to be a prophet. And the Roman authorities weren't cool with that and kind of massacred him, because that's what empires do when people are acting out of line. We don't get more details than that, but that is the thing that the tribune, the proconsul, is alluding to here when he says, hey, I know you're not that other guy that we're looking for, because they never caught the actual leader. They never caught the Egyptian. But the Roman's saying, hey, I know you're not that guy because you're not speaking that language. You're speaking Greek, so you can't be that guy. So that's a plus in Paul's favor. All right. And then in verse 40, as they're headed into the barracks, for whatever reason, the tribune gives Paul permission to speak. And it's like, why? Like, things are out of hand. Like, why would you let Paul speak if you were that Roman? Like, you know, nothing that comes out of his mouth is going to make this situation any less tense. Like, you know that. You have to know that. Or if you don't know that, you're bad at your job. So I would take this as evidence that things are at work here that are beyond human control at this point. Because any Roman tribune, any Roman official worth their salt would be like, no, guy, you don't get to talk. Get in the barracks. We'll sort this out later. But there's no way I'm going to let Paul address that crowd, because it's going to make everything worse. And that is where chapter 21 ends, on a great cliffhanger where a hush comes over the crowd as Paul prepares to speak there in Jerusalem. And we'll pick up with Paul's speech and see how it gets resolved in chapter 22. Thanks for watching. Thanks for engaging in the Acts Challenge, and take care, friends.